Ethan Grayson stepped out of his old pickup truck, shutting the door with a loud clunk that echoed through the nearly empty parking lot. The afternoon in Indianapolis was still warm, the sky clear, but his mind was clouded by a thought. A thought that had been circling in his head for months. Was his bank truly as fair as he believed? He was the founder and CEO of Grayson Trust, a bank he had built from nothing. It wasn't just a business, it was his legacy, his passion. Ethan had spent over a decade creating a financial system that he believed would serve everyone equally. No special privileges for those with fat accounts, no discrimination based on appearance or background. But in recent months, he had heard troubling stories, nothing big enough to make the news, but enough to keep him up at night. A friend had mentioned how a black customer was scrutinized more harshly when withdrawing money. A former employee had whispered that certain branches did not treat ordinary-looking customers fairly. He wanted to believe these were just misunderstandings, that Grayson Trust's policies were still being followed. But Ethan wasn't the kind of CEO who sat in an office and trusted polished reports. He needed to see it firsthand, experience it personally, and most importantly, feel the truth with his own heart. Today, Ethan was not the CEO. No expensive suit, no Rolex watch, no private driver opening his car door. He wore an old button-up shirt, jeans, and a pair of worn-out sneakers. Nothing about him said millionaire, nothing suggested he was the owner of a financial empire. He wanted to see how an ordinary customer would be treated. This was not a random branch. 3 years ago, he had personally cut the ribbon at this location's grand opening. That day, he had stood on a stage, microphone in hand, speaking about the importance of transparency, fairness, and trust in banking. That day, Todd Larson, the branch manager, had shaken his hand, smiling with pride, promising to uphold Grayson Trust's vision. But today, as Ethan walked into this branch, no one recognized him. The automatic glass doors slid open, the scent of fresh printer paper and citrus-scented air freshener hitting him. The banking hall was quiet, with only a few customers waiting and employees handling transactions. Ethan stepped up to the counter, keeping his voice calm and friendly. "Hello, I'd like to withdraw $5,000 from my account." The teller, a young woman in her early 20s, did not look up at him right away. No smile. No greeting. No small talk. She simply pushed a withdrawal slip toward him and spoke impatiently. "Fill this out." Ethan raised an eyebrow. There was nothing wrong with the process, but that tone. He filled out the form completely and handed it back. But as soon as the teller saw the amount, her expression immediately changed. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion, and she gripped the paper tighter than necessary. She gave Ethan a second look, this time evaluating him from head to toe, then silently took his ID. Ethan could see the moment she made her decision. Instead of processing the transaction, she walked away without a word, disappearing into the branch manager's office. Ethan started observing the room. A man in a suit stepped up to another teller behind him, and was greeted with a polite smile. No extra forms. No delays. A middle-aged woman in a floral dress was helped right away. There were no signs that they were being asked to go through what he was experiencing. Ethan sighed, feeling a slow-burning anger in his chest. Not because of the money, but because of the blatant unfairness happening in the very bank he had built. He waited. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 5 minutes passed. Finally, the manager's office door opened. Todd Larson, the man who had once shaken his hand at the grand opening, walked out with a serious expression. He looked at Ethan as if assessing whether he belonged there at all. "Sir, I understand you want to withdraw $5,000? Todd asked, his voice cautious. Ethan calmly nodded. "Yes. This is my account, and here is my ID." Todd took his ID, holding it up to the light, then suddenly asked a question completely unrelated to the transaction. "What do you do for a living?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. This was not a standard question for a withdrawal. He gave a slight smile, though his eyes were cold. "I work in finance." Todd pressed further. "More specifically?" Ethan answered slowly. "Banking." Todd nodded slowly, but instead of processing the transaction, he said in a calculated tone, "I'm sorry, but we cannot verify this transaction at this time." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. "You can check my account right now." His voice remained calm, but firm. Todd kept up his fake composure. "We require additional documents for verification, such as a utility bill or other forms of ID." Ethan folded his arms, letting out a quiet chuckle. "If I were wearing a suit and a Rolex, would you still need these documents?" Todd's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Instead, he pressed a button under the counter. Within seconds, a security guard appeared. Ethan couldn't believe what was happening. He was standing inside his own bank, and yet he was being treated like a suspicious outsider. And at that moment, Ethan knew. The real test was just beginning. Ethan Grayson stood still, his fury boiling inside, but his face remained perfectly calm. The man in front of him, Todd Larson, the branch manager, had just made a grave mistake. Not because he refused the withdrawal. Not because he requested additional documents. But because he believed Ethan didn't belong here. Todd had judged him the moment he saw the old button-up shirt and worn-out sneakers. And now, instead of handling the transaction professionally, he had called security. Ethan didn't need to ask to know what was running through Todd's mind. Who does this guy think he is, walking in here, trying to withdraw a large sum without extra verification? He must be a fraud. A blatant insult, right inside the bank Ethan had built, inside the very branch he had personally approved. And now, Todd had decided to escalate things even further. A tall man in a dark blue security uniform emerged from the back office, his eyes scanning Ethan. His steps were slow, but intentional. One hand rested near his belt, close to his radio and baton. A small gesture, but one full of meaning. He wasn't here to assist with the transaction. He wasn't here to help a customer. He was here to deal with a problem. And to them, Ethan was that problem. Todd pretended nothing was out of the ordinary, his voice smooth, controlled, like he was just following standard procedure. "We just want to ensure all transactions comply with security regulations." Ethan narrowed his eyes, his voice cold. "So, you're saying I'm a security threat?" Todd chuckled lightly, but there was no sincerity in it. "We're just following protocol, Mr. Grayson." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You called security simply because I asked to withdraw money from my own account?" No answer. Todd knew he had been caught. But instead of backing down, he chose to double down on his mistake. The security guard stepped closer, his deep voice breaking the silence. "Is there a problem here, sir?" Ethan turned to him, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the tension in the room. "That's a great question. I'd like to know as well." He glanced at Todd, then at the teller, who stood frozen, avoiding his gaze. "I came here with all the required documents. I provided my ID, followed the process, did everything by the book. And instead of handling my transaction, they chose to treat me like a threat." The security guard hesitated. Ethan continued, speaking slower this time. "So, help me understand, sir. Were you called here to assist me in withdrawing my own money? Or were you called here to remove me from a bank that I own?" The security guard stopped in his tracks. The question was too direct. He looked at Todd, waiting for instructions. But Todd said nothing, because he realized the situation had already spun out of his control. The guard cleared his throat, trying to keep his professionalism. "I was only called in when there's a situation requiring assistance." Ethan let out a small, humorless chuckle. "Well then, let me clarify, I don't need assistance. I just need to withdraw my money and walk out of here." Silence. Every eye in the bank was now on them. Customers were starting to realize something was very, very wrong. Ethan turned to Todd, his voice as sharp as a blade. "Now you have two choices. Either you process this transaction right now, or I make sure this is the last day you ever work here." Todd's face drained of color. His hands trembled slightly. The air in the bank grew thick. Todd knew he couldn't ignore this any longer. But the arrogance of a small-minded manager wouldn't let him admit defeat so easily. So, he made one last, desperate attempt to regain control. He lifted a hand, as if to reassert his authority. "I think if you could just provide additional verification." But before he could finish, Ethan pulled out his phone and started recording. The entire bank fell into dead silence. Todd froze. Ethan looked directly into the camera, his voice steady, unwavering. "This is Todd Larson, the branch manager of Grayson Trust, Indianapolis. He has just denied my transaction despite me providing valid identification and following standard procedures. He also called security to prevent me from withdrawing my own money, while other customers were not asked for any extra verification." Todd started sweating. Ethan turned the camera toward the security guard. "And here is the security officer, who was called in, not to protect customers, but to remove a man who simply wanted access to his own funds." Then, he stopped recording, slid his phone back into his pocket, and turned to Todd. This time, there was nowhere left to hide. "Now, Todd," Ethan said slowly, "would you like to process my transaction, or should I send this video directly to the executive board?" Todd opened his mouth, but no words came out. Because he knew that no excuse could save him now. And in that moment, he realized, his career was over. Todd Larson stood frozen, sweat beading on his forehead. Every eye in the bank was now fixed on him, no longer with respect, no longer with authority. The employees, the customers, even the security guard, they all realized he had made a colossal mistake. Todd tried to maintain his composure, but his voice betrayed his nervousness. "Mr. Grayson, perhaps we could discuss this matter privately?" Ethan let out a cold chuckle, his gaze razor-sharp. "You want to talk in private, Todd?" He raised an eyebrow. "Don't you think this situation has already become quite public?" Todd swallowed hard. He knew there was no escaping this. Ethan took a deep breath, then locked eyes with Todd. "Let me help you understand this situation." He tapped his fingers lightly on the phone in his pocket, a reminder of the damning video he had just recorded. "You discriminated against a customer without any legitimate reason. You refused to process a transaction that had no actual issue. You called security to intimidate someone simply trying to withdraw money from their own account. And now, you're scrambling to flip the situation in your favor." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in before delivering the final blow. "So tell me, Todd, how do you think this is going to end?" Todd couldn't hide the panic spreading across his face anymore. The silence in the room was suffocating. No one dared to look at Todd. They all knew a storm was coming, and none of them wanted to get caught in it. An elderly customer, who had been watching the entire scene unfold, shook his head and muttered under his breath. "Shameful." Todd clenched his fists, desperately searching for an excuse. But Ethan had run out of patience. "I don't want to hear another justification." Ethan cut him off. "You know exactly what you did. And now, you will take responsibility." Todd opened his mouth, but Ethan continued before he could get a word out. "You have two choices." The entire room froze. "First option, you process my transaction immediately, apologize to every customer and employee here, and then hand in your resignation." Todd took a shaky breath, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal searching for an exit. "And the second option?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan smirked. "I send this video to the board, the press, and every customer of Grayson Trust." The words hit like a hammer. Todd went pale, understanding that his career was hanging by a thread. Todd finally broke. I'll process the transaction now," he mumbled. Ethan's expression remained ice-cold. "Louder." Todd swallowed hard and forced himself to say it again. "I will process the transaction now." Ethan didn't move, just stared at him. "And the apology?" Todd shut his eyes for a moment, as if swallowing the last remnants of his pride. Then, he turned to the room and, with reluctance dripping from every word, said, "I apologize for the misunderstanding." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "No, Todd. Not a misunderstanding. You apologize because you were wrong. Todd looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole, but he had no choice. I apologize because I was wrong. The entire banking hall fell silent. Ethan nodded. Good. Now process my transaction. Todd quickly instructed the teller to complete the withdrawal, but the humiliation on his face was undeniable. As Ethan took the cash, he looked at Todd one last time and spoke softly, yet with undeniable authority. You have 24 hours to submit your resignation. If you don't, I will personally ensure that you never work in finance again. Todd gulped, knowing there was no room for argument. The next day, Grayson Trust issued an internal statement. Todd Larson was immediately dismissed. An internal investigation was launched to identify other cases of discrimination within bank branches. Every Grayson Trust employee was required to undergo mandatory training on customer service and unconscious bias. But Ethan didn't stop there. He set up a direct hotline where customers could report any unfair treatment they experienced at any Grayson Trust location. And the result? Within weeks, customers noticed a difference. Employees became more professional, more courteous, and those who had once felt ignored or mistreated were finally being served with the respect they deserved. And as for Ethan? He never forgot that day. Not because of the anger. Not because of the frustration. But because it served as a reminder that policies only matter when the people enforcing them believe in them. And if even a CEO could be treated unfairly in his own bank, then what had been happening to the customers who had no power to fight back? News of the incident spread like wildfire across the Grayson Trust banking network. Employees at other branches began whispering among themselves. Senior management found themselves in an uncomfortable position, forced to answer pressing questions. How could a branch manager treat a customer this way, especially when that customer was the CEO? How many other incidents like this have gone unnoticed? And most importantly, if even the CEO was treated like this, what happens to regular customers? A crisis meeting with the entire leadership team was called the very next day. Ethan sat at the head of the table, his gaze sweeping across the familiar faces, people who had worked alongside him for years, who had helped him build this bank. But today, he didn't see pride or confidence in their eyes. He saw fear. Because they all knew, Ethan was not going to let this slide. Ethan didn't start with accusations. Instead, he turned on the large screen in the conference room and played the video he had recorded at the branch. The silence was absolute. They saw Todd Larson, arrogant and dismissive, denying the transaction. They saw the hesitation of the teller, caught in an awkward dilemma. They saw security called in for no valid reason. And most importantly, they saw clear, undeniable discrimination happening within the very system they had built. When the video ended, Ethan looked around the table and spoke, his voice calm but firm. Does anyone here think this was just an isolated mistake? No one answered. Ethan nodded. Exactly. Because we all know this isn't just one bad apple. He stood up, placing both hands on the table, his voice carrying the weight of accountability. We convinced ourselves that as long as we had fair policies, people would follow them. He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he continued, slow and deliberate. But yesterday, I proved that policies on paper mean nothing if the people enforcing them don't believe in them. The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy storm cloud. Ethan wasn't interested in just an apology. He wanted real change. And so, he announced immediate reforms. 1. Overhauling customer service standards. All customer service employees would be evaluated based on how fairly they treated customers. Any employee caught discriminating against customers would be immediately terminated. Customers would now have the power to report any unfair treatment without fear of retaliation. 2. Mandatory training for all employees. Every employee, from tellers to senior managers, must complete mandatory training on recognizing bias in financial services. This training wasn't about just following protocol, it was about ensuring every customer was treated with equal respect, regardless of appearance, clothing, or background. 3. A revamped customer feedback system. A confidential hotline would be created, allowing customers to report discriminatory behavior. All reports would go directly to executive leadership, bypassing branch management to prevent cover-ups. 4. Surprise audits and secret evaluations. Ethan announced that there would now be random, undercover evaluations at all branches. These audits would be conducted by either himself or designated executives. Any branch found guilty of discriminatory behavior would face immediate review, and those responsible would face consequences. No one in the room dared to argue, because they knew Ethan was right. One of the longtime senior managers cleared his throat and hesitantly said, "Ethan, what you're doing, it's going to make some people uncomfortable." Ethan's lips curled into a cold, knowing smile. "Good. If someone feels uncomfortable about treating customers fairly, then they shouldn't be working here." Silence. They all understood. Grace and Trust was entering a new era, one where bias would no longer be tolerated. In just 4 weeks, the impact was undeniable. White heavy checkmark customer complaints dropped by 40%, an unprecedented improvement. White heavy checkmark customers who had previously felt discriminated against began returning, noticing a genuine shift in service. White heavy checkmark employees became more aware of their behavior, not out of fear, but because they began understanding the true value of fair service. 1 month later, in a company-wide meeting, Ethan stood before the entire workforce and made his final declaration. "I don't care if you're a new hire or a senior manager. If you care more about your title than your customers, you don't belong here. And if treating customers fairly makes you uncomfortable, then you're in the wrong industry." The room erupted in applause. Because they all knew. Ethan was not just a CEO sitting in an office. He was a leader who challenged the system and fought for real change. Ethan Grayson didn't just change his own bank, he ignited a revolution. What happened at the Indianapolis branch wasn't just an internal scandal. As customers and employees began sharing the story on social media, it spread like wildfire. Posts, videos, and comments flooded financial forums. The headlines exploded across major news outlets. Newspaper: CEO denied by his own bank, and his response changed the entire system. Newspaper: Ethan Grayson, the man who challenged the banking industry. Newspaper: Grayson Trust's bold reforms. Will other banks keep up? Soon, other banks began feeling the pressure. Their customers started asking questions. Small Blue Diamond: Is my bank treating me fairly? Small Blue Diamond: If a bank CEO can be discriminated against, what about us, ordinary customers? Small Blue Diamond: Will other banks implement reforms like Grayson Trust? And just like that, the entire financial industry found itself forced to change. Less than a month after the incident, major banks across the country began implementing similar reforms. Bank Wells & Company announced a full-scale internal audit to identify bias and discrimination within its operations. Bank Northway Financial launched a comprehensive training program for employees to recognize and eliminate bias in customer service. Bank Metrobank introduced a new branch rating system, allowing customers to score service quality and report any instances of unfair treatment. An industry notoriously slow to change was now being forced to evolve, all because one CEO refused to stay silent. The story was too big to remain just a financial news topic. Ethan received interview requests from major television networks. Television CBS News wanted to discuss the systemic flaws in banking. Television CNN Business sought insight into how his leadership had shaken the industry. Television TED Talks invited him to speak about the importance of fairness in business. During his interview on Good Morning America, the host asked, "What was the first thing you did after leaving that branch?" Ethan smiled, but there was steel in his eyes. "I went back to my office, reviewed every system we had in place, and asked myself, how many people have gone through the same thing, with no way to fight back?" The host nodded before asking, "Why do you think your story resonated so deeply with people?" Ethan looked straight into the camera and delivered a powerful truth. "Because everyone, at some point in their life, has been judged unfairly, simply for how they look." The audience erupted in applause. At that moment, Ethan Grayson was no longer just a CEO. He had become a symbol of justice in the financial world. Grayson Trust was no longer just another bank. In just 6 months, the transformation was undeniable. White heavy checkmark customer accounts increased by 35%, as thousands switched banks, drawn to Grayson Trust's commitment to fairness. White heavy checkmark customer satisfaction soared to 92%, well above the industry average. White heavy checkmark complaints about unfair treatment dropped by nearly 70%, proving the reforms were more than just words. But Ethan wasn't done yet. He had a bigger vision. Ethan launched an initiative never before seen in banking. Rocket, the world's first truly fair banking system. Lightbulb, no discrimination. No bias. Just fairness. He hired a team of experts to develop an AI-driven monitoring system to detect and prevent bias in financial transactions. This system would warning flag unusual verification requests if employees asked some customers for extra documents, but not others. Warning analyze rejection rates to detect patterns of unfair loan denials or transaction refusals. Warning monitor employee behavior to ensure all customers received equal treatment, regardless of appearance. This system wouldn't just transform Grayson Trust. It would set a new standard for the entire banking industry. Ethan wasn't just changing his own bank. He was rewriting the future of finance. 1 year after the Indianapolis branch incident, Ethan stood on the stage of the Global Finance Summit, looking out at a crowd of banking executives from around the world. He took a deep breath, then spoke. "A year ago, I was denied access to my own money, in my own bank. I was dismissed, judged, and treated unfairly. But I didn't stay silent. I turned my anger into action. And that action changed everything." He paused, scanning the audience. Then, his tone sharpened as he asked, "The question is, what will you do when faced with injustice? Will you accept it as just the way things are? Or will you stand up, fight back, and change it?" A heavy silence filled the room. Then, one by one, people stood up and applauded. Because they knew. Ethan Grayson had done what so many only dreamed of. He had transformed a broken system into something better for everyone. And that was his true legacy.